All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Frank Om, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for our conversation on a topic I'm very excited about and I've been wanting to dive deeper into for a while now, which is the four-party peace talks of the late 1990s. I run the North Korea program here at the U.S. Institute of Peace. So before I begin, I just want to introduce my organization for those of you who are not familiar. The U.S. Institute of Peace is a national, nonpartisan, and independent institute founded and funded by Congress that has the goal of preventing, mitigating, and resolving violent conflict. And you can find out more about our work at usip.org. Okay, so today's discussion will be a little bit different because we're not going to have each of the three speakers provide set remarks. Instead, we're going to jump right into a moderator-led Q&A discussion with brief for answers, and also done in a very informal fashion where the other speakers can jump in if they want. I've tried to organize the questions thematically and chronologically so that it should be relatively easy to follow. And I want to start with providing a bit of a background to help paint the scene. So many people who are interested in the Korean Peninsula, both as casual observers or as experienced experts, they often wonder why the United States and North Korea haven't already reached a peace agreement and normalized ties like the US has done with other past quote unquote adversaries like China or Vietnam. Well, one could point to North Korea's nuclear weapons program and say that remains the primary obstacle for the US. But North Korea hasn't always had a nuclear program. And in fact, in the 1990s, its nuclear and ballistic missile program was very rudimentary and largely mothballed after the bilateral agreed framework deal shut down its Yongbyon facility in 1994. So this should have been a perfect moment to discuss a more comprehensive peace agreement, especially if both sides were really interested in peace. And in fact, in April 1996, President Clinton and South Korean President Kim Young-sam met on Jeju Island and proposed four-party peace talks with North Korea and China. This proposal sounds radical now, especially when compared to the previous 40 years when the US largely ignored and disengaged from North Korea, but also compared to the last 2 decades where the US approach has been laser focused on North Korea's denuclearization, especially as a prerequisite for any peace talks. In fact, I would argue that the four-party peace talks proposal was the only time in the last 67 years, basically since the 1954 Geneva Conference, in which the US publicly and proactively proposed and engaged on the specific issue of peace and normalization. Of course, there are some other discussions over the years. The two Koreas certainly discussed improved relations many times, but this did not include the US. I think Kissinger may have had some discussions with China and North Korea in the late 70s. And of course, the six-party talks in the mid-2000s contemplated some working groups on normalization. But none of these ideas advanced past the planning stages. So what happened after Clinton and Kim proposed the four-party peace talks? Well, North Korea, despite having sought direct talks with the US for decades, took over a year to respond. And then when it finally engaged, the talks seemed to sputter and not make much progress. So that's the basic framing. I'm sure we'll get into more details, but there obviously isn't much written about this period. Probably for good reason, because there wasn't a whole lot tangible achieved, but still I think it seems to probably warrant more study and attention, especially because these four-party peace talks represent or should represent the process and discussions that we should ideally be striving for, whether it's right now or in the medium term after some sort of interim agreement. Fortunately, we have 3 participants from the US delegation to those talks with us today, and they'll be providing some insights from that period and potential lessons for future peace talks. Also, today's discussion is very timely since Secretaries Blinken and Austin are in Seoul right now, talking with their South Korean counterparts about the future direction of our North Korea policy. So let me jump in and introduce our panelists. Our first one is Bob Carlin, who is a non-resident fellow at the Stimson Center and the former chief of the Northeast Asia Division in the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Next is Philip Yun, who is the president and chief executive officer of the World Affairs Council of Northern California. And back in the 90s, he was a senior policy advisor for the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia at the State Department. And then last is Chip Gregson, who is senior director for China and the Pacific at the Center for the National Interest. He's also former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asian and Pacific Affairs. He was also DoD's representative to the four-party talks. And then before I start the Q&A, let me just note for our audience that you can start getting in your questions in the queue by using the chat box function just below the video player on the USIP event page. Okay, so let me dive right in. And this first question is for Bob. I mentioned earlier that there was this 4-decade period from the end of the Korean War basically to the 1990s in which the two sides had no serious diplomatic interactions or discussions on peace and security. What was the reason for this this gap in interactions during this period?
Frank, thanks you for that really good lead-in. Your first comments on this overall issue. I'd say it frames the problem in a way that really wasn't in anybody's mind at the time. And that's important to understand. One reason that there was no real engagement for so many years after Geneva was neither side was interested. I mean, it's really very simple. When I came to the CIA in 1971, the Korean War was only 18 years distant. 18 years is not a long time in the memory of Washington, D.C. A lot of people had participated in the war. And so the image that people had of North Korea was still of the country that had invaded in 1950. Moreover, the Pueblo incident was only 2 years distance, shoot down of the EC-121, the attack on the Blue House. So the image of North Korea at that time was of and rightly so, was a very belligerent, aggressive problem. Yeah, and South Korea was relatively weak at that time, don't forget. It was a basket case economically still. So we weren't interested in engaging with North Korea. It was a military problem. It was an I&W problem. Big question was, are they going to attack? For their part, the North Koreans were not interested in dealing with us. They wanted us off the peninsula, period. From the late 50s through the early 70s to the mid 70s, they only wanted to deal with the South Koreans. And I don't think seriously, but the proposals for peace talks were all aimed at Seoul. They thought the United States had nothing to do with that we should leave. In 74, they shifted because they were angry at the South Koreans. They wanted to belittle Park Chung-hee, and so they made a proposal to the Americans for peace talks. I don't think it was serious, but it was the first time that they had aimed something like that at us. But from then until 1990, why wasn't there any real serious engagement? Well, beginning in '88, after the Olympics, we started slowly to reach out to the North Koreans, fairly low level. In 1990 or so, when the Soviet Union collapsed, that's when Kim Il-sung made a strategic decision. He needed normalization with the Americans. And from that point on, you began to see little by little increasing signals from the North Koreans that they wanted serious contact with the Americans. That got us to the agreed framework. And then came, and I guess we'll get into this later, the four-party talks was a bolt from the blue. It was not a carefully considered proposal, and I'll talk more about it later. I think it put the North Koreans significantly off balance.
Well, Bob, that actually gets into my next question. And also, let me add that if Phil, Chip, any of you want to jump in, just let me know. You can raise your hand just to signal that. But that's a great segue, Bob, because we talk about the 1990s, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Notewu was implementing his Ostpolitik policy, trying to reach out. And so there was certainly a shift, right? And not only that, that's when we get the signals about North Korea threatening to advance their nuclear weapons. So I think, this is where we see more engagement. I think the first senior level engagement at the high level was Arnold Cantor and Kim Young-sam in New York in I think 1992. And then
January 92.
And then you had Jimmy Carter and Kim Il-sung meet in 94. And then, of course, the Gallucci-led meetings led to the agreed framework. But then 18 months after that was the proposal for the four-party peace talks. So you already addressed it a little bit, but how did the idea for the four-party peace talks come about?
Bill, go ahead, take it.
Well, if you talk with, I think Bob said it right. It was sort of a bolt out of the blue for the North Koreans. I think it caught the State Department, JCS, and DOD. Chip, I would like you to chime in here, sort of flat-footed as well. I try to dig a little bit behind as to how that all happened, and the best that I can determine was that there was this desire. It was staff-led to some degree. We knew that the South Koreans were very unhappy about feeling left out on the sidelines because the U.S. and the DPRK had engaged so much with the agreed framework, and then we had a submarine incident at that point too. So they were trying to get back into what they seemed in a meaningful position and not being on the sidelines. I think the United States was worried about the ROK because they wanted everyone to be in line, and there was help that was going to be needed to implement the agreed framework, mainly money. And we're also afraid that the agreed framework, structure might fall apart. So there's an incentive to try to do something. And, the best that, I've done a little bit digging here and there. I think it was staff driven. I think it was mostly through the National Security Council and the ROK. And, there are all these kind of rumors. I think Bob Suettinger at that point, and, maybe Bob would be able to tell us that there was some conversations about this kind of thing coming about. And I think then it just sort of percolated up. And, that's sort of what I've been able to tell. But, in terms of getting a hard description through the State Department, I think the description there was it was a surprise.
It's interesting because there's moments in history where it seems like these grand ideas come together pretty quickly with not years and years of preparation. I think one example is the presidential nuclear initiatives in the early 90s from President Bush, but also the four-party peace talks ideas. Bob and Chip, anything else to chip in on that question?
I can add a personal perspective. Phil's absolutely right that the announcement about the four-party talks caught DOD flat-footed. I was still working for the Marine Corps when that announcement was made, and I was in fact at a conference in New Orleans doing Marine Corps business when suddenly found out that my itinerary changed and also my work had changed, that I was supposed to go to the Pentagon and work for some guy named Campbell. And by the way, don't fly back to Washington. Your tickets have been changed. You're going to Geneva. So I show up at Geneva and get up the next morning, jet lagged and everything else. Walk into the four-party talks, and there's an officer from the command in Korea walking next to me, and he's got a paperback book. And I said, "Why do you have that?" He said, "You'll see." We got about 5 minutes into the talk, and the South Korean interpreter and the North Korean interpreter get into a really heated argument with each other. So I turned to the guy next to me and said, "What's this all about?" And he said, "They're arguing about what was said." I made the obvious comment that they both speak Korean. What's the problem? He says, that's lesson one. There are different dialects between South and North Korea. I said, what's lesson two? He said, bring a paperback book next time. And then he opens a book and starts reading it. That was a guy named Mike Hayden. You might recall he went on to other things. The talks were, big surprise to DOD. We'd gone from a position when the North Korean nuclear program surfaced, 1993-ish, 4, to a big muscular response, and we were moving forces around and talking about deployments and everything. That very quickly got shut down in favor of negotiations, but nobody knew what the negotiations are going to look like. So when it was announced that it was this four-party thing, it saved an awful lot of staff work because there wasn't a lot of time to do staff work. So we just went to it, and it started from that. The sessions were rather bereft of results, but at least it served the purpose of actually having dialogue with the North Koreans. So that was a gain from this in the early days, in my estimation.
As a former staffer at OSD, sometimes I appreciate it when we don't have too much time to plan and you can just quickly move into the meetings. So let me move on. We had the proposal from Clinton and Kim Young-sam. North Korea hears it. They've been clamoring for talks with the US, but they took over a year to respond. The proposal was made April 1996. I think they finally responded April 1997. Why the hesitation from North Korea? Again, I'll direct it to Bob first, but anyone can join in after.
Well, the question I would ask the question differently, which is, why wouldn't they hesitate? They had the agreed framework, which was an extremely important agreement with the US. We were just getting into it. Both sides were moving ahead with it. And suddenly, out of nowhere, comes this idea that the South Koreans and the Chinese should join in talks. The question in Pyongyang was, why? What is this about? Is Washington interested in the agreed framework, or isn't it? Moreover, Pyongyang had no desire to deal with South Korea or Kim Young-sam. Kim Young-sam had done what he could to undermine Kim Jong-il when he came in. The South Koreans, as far as the North was concerned, the South Koreans were being bloody-minded. They were only going to get in the way. And as for the Chinese, the North Korean position was, why the Chinese? Why should they take part in this? They withdrew their forces in 1950, whenever it was, 57, 58. They don't have anything to do with this issue anymore. So they shouldn't be part of this process. So naturally, it would take the North Koreans a long time to be convinced that this is what they needed to do.
I think right before the proposal in April 96, the North Koreans had also been proposing bilateral talks. So it seems they were set back a little bit by the four-party proposal, again, as you mentioned, Bob, because they weren't sure about why China and South Korea had to be involved, right? Phil, you were going to say.
Yeah, so I think the North Korean reaction could be really categorized, I've heard in many ways, confused, right? I think Bob is absolutely right. The agreed framework represented, I think, two different approaches. And this is where fundamentally the United States and North Korea kind of missed each other. They were going at two different planes, right? North Korea looked at the agreed framework really as a relationship, right? The possibility of normalization. That's how they looked at the agreed framework, while the United States looked at it strictly as a non-proliferation agreement. So right there, you've got a huge disconnect. And then what happens is that you get what was called really the language of the announcement itself that came out. The language itself was intentionally made ambiguous. And so therefore the North Koreans are saying, well, what does this actually mean? So if you want to go into the nitty gritty, we made it ambiguous so we could, the South Koreans and the United States made it ambiguous so they could, there could be some negotiations involved. The North Koreans are saying, well, what does this mean? I mean, it was like, what's the agenda going to be? The statement said something about they prohibited U.S. and North Korea talking about peace-related issues. Well, what does that mean, right? And then, what does a peace arrangement or regime, what does that mean? So they had all these questions that rightly so. And again, you have to realize the context. North Korea desperately needed food. The regime was under incredible amount of stress. And therefore, for North Korea, for North Korea, every move politically is an existential decision for them. That's how they looked at it. For us, it's like one of 30 things on our plate. And therefore, that's why you have to expect them to be very cautious about how they go about any kind of major decisions, particularly something like this.
It's interesting that we thought that we were making it easier for North Korea by making it a little more ambiguous and not too specific. But their perception is, wait, what does this mean, right? But I'm glad you brought up some of these vague terms like peace regime and peace arrangements, because we're going to get to that next. So one of our main aspirations for the Korean Peninsula is a peace regime to replace the armistice regime. It's one of the 4 goals stated in the 2018 Singapore statement. I always thought the first mention of a peace regime was actually in the 6-party talks 2005 joint statement. But as you point out, it was preceded that, and it was brought up at least as early as the 4-party talks proposal. In fact, there were 2 committees that one of the few things that was actually agreed upon in the 4-party talks was the idea of the 2 committees, right? One for a peace regime and another committee related to tension reduction. So can you talk a little bit, I'm addressing this to Phil, but can you talk a little bit about these terms, the ambiguity, how they may have been perceived by the 4 parties, peace regime, peace arrangements? What were the nuances here? So
it's kind of funny. The story for me was that, Clinton had just been reelected. I had been at the department for about 3 years at that point. I'd stayed away from North Korea and Korea intentionally, but with the second term, I wanted to get more involved. So I remember talking to my boss, Stanley Roth, and I said, I want to get involved in this North Korea stuff. Can I, let me know. So he comes back to me and says, you're a lawyer, right? I go, yes, I am. And he goes, okay, well, they just decided that they're going to have a subcommittee on the peace regime. I want you to be the head, the head of that, the delegation for that subcommittee. So I remember this distinctly because Bob was one of the first people I went to say, so what is a peace regime, right? And Bob looks at me and goes, I don't know. It's whatever we decide it's going to be, and then he gave me all the paperwork that was about, what the various positions had been. And so it was intentionally ambiguous because there had been so much fight about who was going to sign what and how. And it had been such a zero-sum game where it was intractable. I mean, North Korea said, we're only going to sign it with the United States. And South Korea said, we're only going to sign it with North Korea, and the United States shouldn't be involved in this, right? So, that's a zero-sum situation. And so, being a lawyer, if, good lawyers, and I wasn't part of the legal team at the department, but good lawyers can be very creative in kind of the arrangements. So if you have peace treaty, that's one document. Peace regime means there can be so many structures. And the way I looked at it, me being a business lawyer at that point, is you can structure a deal in any way you want to get the desired outcomes that you want to have. And there were so many issues related to that. Was the US-ROK alliance, the withdrawal of US troops, who signs, all of these things. And so peace regime was a very ambiguous statement to be able to deal with all of those and to make some adjustments according to what was necessary on the ground. And I think the South Koreans felt that way as well. And the Chinese were, interestingly, and Bob talks about this first, the North Koreans were, I think, a little worried that it was going to be a 1-on-3 because the Chinese initial position had been, well, we think, inter-Korean issues should be, dealt with between North and South Korea. So in fact, they were supporting the South Korean position.
And was there progress made in the peace regime subcommittee?
No, not really. We saw, it was a lot of talk, a lot of rhetoric, a lot of positioning. And I think and just hearing sort of what you had heard for many, many years before that. They were on a very short lease. And I think that Chip said it just right, where there wasn't a lot of substantive progress, because what happened was they wanted a peace treaty signed first. And then they thought, it was sort of typical, let's go top down. So peace treaty first, end it, and then we can talk about the other issues. The United States was the other way around. Let's do confidence building. A piece of paper is not going to mean anything if nothing changes on the ground. So let's work on confidence building. The United States was very serious about that, but we got nowhere on any of that. So again, two fundamentally different approaches to this particular problem.
Phil, I'm glad you brought up some of the other ideas that we'll get into, like the U.S.-ROC alliance and the U.S. troop presence, particularly because if we're talking about treaty, that has a specific legal definition, and it can be binding and have implications for things like troop presence in the Korean Peninsula, whereas a regime or peace arrangements is a lot more vague, not legally binding, and maybe not as threatening to some of our equities and interests. So with that said, recognizing that there was the peace regime subcommittee, there was also the tensions reduction, confidence building subcommittee, right? And then maybe I'll direct this next question to Chip. So we have this other subcommittee on tension reduction. But I think, so throughout the four-party talks, this issue about U.S. troop withdrawal was being raised, right? So North Korea wanted that to be on the agenda, U.S. troop withdrawal. And I think particularly during the second round in March 1998 of the talks, North Korea requested that specifically, that U.S. troop withdrawal be put on the agenda. Of course,
let me ask a question. Is that a quote? Or did they want, quote, the disposition of U.S. troops? Did they use the word withdrawal? I don't think so, but I'm not positive.
Actually, you guys were there, so please clarify. I'm going by secondhand sources, news articles. But again, I think the idea of a discussion about U.S. troops being on the agenda was something that North Korea raised, at a minimum, right?
Right.
And I think at some point that seemed to have depressed the momentum for talks with that. And there probably were other ideas, things that North Korea raised, like humanitarian assistance or focusing just on a U.S. DPRK treaty. But let's focus right now on the idea of U.S. troop withdrawal and that being on the agenda. What was the U.S. government's thinking when they heard this sort of counter proposal from the North Korean side? Again, this is the Chip.
I can characterize, I think, what the feeling was inside DOD, as I recall, in the interminable meetings that Phil and I and others sat through. I'm not sure there was any violent objection to DOD's position from the other agencies, but troop withdrawal very, very much at the end of the process. And as I think you said earlier, Frank, just signing a piece of paper doesn't make the facts on the ground change. And that's exactly where the feeling was. A couple of things in the background on this. During most of the time between 1950 and 1990, the Republic of Korea was not a democracy, it was a dictatorship, and its forces reflected the way dictatorships work. A lot of soldiers, a lot of cannon fodder, not maybe less sophistication in their plans than comes from democratic governments and militaries from democratic governments. The nuclear thing came out of the blue in the early 90s, and that started to eclipse all the other issues that were at play on the peninsula. Number one, Korea democratized, and from my personal observation, with a lot of exercises in Korea before they became a democracy and after they became a democracy, the proficiency of their armed forces went up very rapidly. They had to learn to be able to delegate. They had to learn to use their junior leaders. They did all that. The things that we tried to teach them over the years, turns out they learned it better than we thought. But then the nuclear issue eclipsed everything else. And one of the issues that rarely, if ever, comes up on this is that North Korea has, and check me if my sources are wrong, Bob, from the intel community, but North Korea has over 10,000 pieces of long-range artillery in the Kaesong Heights overlooking Seoul. And Rand in those days did a series of war games on how long it would take to reduce this threat to one of the, if not the biggest mega center on the planet. And the findings aren't good. So North Korea's capital is exceedingly vulnerable to just conventional fires, let alone anything that comes up in the nuclear arena. North Korea was very smart when they lost the money from the collapse of the Soviet Union. They changed things and they really went into creating advantages that could be imposed from long range. And 80% of their forces are deployed within range of the demilitarized zone, and South Korea's forces are not there. So we in the Department of Defense were not in favor of withdrawing what looked to us like one of the linchpins of deterrence against North Korea. A little more complex is an agreement to withdraw U.S. forces that was not agreed to by the South Koreans. Would have the effect of splitting the alliance. So this was a very clever move for North Korea to put on the chessboard, and one very, very hard for us to respond to in any way other than just saying no.
Thanks for that background, Chip. And just another data point is the transfer of peacetime control over ROK forces happened just a few years earlier in 1994. So that threat environment that you painted was absolutely true. Bob,
and that the transfer of peacetime OPCON was very significant. Our Korean allies kept telling us, we need this, we need peacetime OPCON. We had the same conservatism of the Pentagon that y'all have come to expect and love, I'm sure, that where we were saying not so fast, let's study this, we studied this, we did it. And yeah, it was the right thing to do. Now we're still into transfer of wartime OPCON. And the agreement between the Republic of Korea and the United States is that when conditions are met, we will do this. And the biggest stumbling block to doing this is the command and control structure, not the arrangements. The arrangements are agreed to once we get the structure in place, but it remains to be seen if and when South Korea is going to devote the resources to build out the command and control structure, the radios, the wires, all that other stuff that are needed to control a very, very sophisticated command and control arrangement that is not equaled anywhere else in the world. The Combined Forces Command is a unique beast. And what we don't want to do is damage deterrence in the interest of progress to enhance deterrence. And done right, South Koreans having wartime OPCON, I think, can be done to enhance deterrence, but we can't do it in such a sense that it leaves us in a less competent position than we are now.
That's a very salient point. Thank you, Chip. And certainly it's one of the wartime OPCON transfer is one of President Moon's top priorities. We're seeing it become more and more of an issue as it factors into the military exercise and testing South Korea's capability to assume the lead of the combined defense, but also in terms of South Korea's own ramp up of their military capabilities, because that's one of the conditions for the transfer of wartime OPCON, acquiring these capabilities, right? Before I go to Bob, I saw you have your hand up. Just a reminder to the audience that if you want to ask a question, there's a chat box right beneath the video player on the main page. Bob.
Let me back up. This question of U.S. forces is extremely important and not well understood. You mentioned that in January 92, we had our first high-level meeting with the North Koreans, which I was sitting in. And the North Koreans there told us, in so many words, that we could keep our troops in Korea until, and it was way off in the distant future. In the agreed framework talks, question of U.S. forces never came up. Never came up. So in 90, and in fact, they were telling us behind the scenes, yeah, you can keep your troops. As long as they're not pointed at us, you can keep your troops in Korea. So in 96, when they asked to put it on the agenda, and I recall, Chip, DOD reacted strenuously against that. In no uncertain terms, it can't go on the agenda. And our argument from state was they just need it there so they can demonstrate to Pyongyang that at least something that North Korea wants to talk about is on the agenda. Subsequently, the head of the North Korean delegation took us aside and said, I need something on the agenda. Why won't you let it? We're not going to call for U.S. withdrawal, but we need something on the agenda to make it look like these meetings actually represent a North Korean interest as well. So I think it was a misfire on our part. And it was a problem within the U.S. government. It wasn't really between North Korea and the U.S.
Before I turn to you, I want to follow up. I'm glad you brought up that point because there is this equivocation from North Korea. You mentioned how they didn't bring it up in that first meeting. I've also read that they didn't bring it up to Kim Dae-jung. He had talks with Kim Jong-il. And of course, in the recent Trump-Kim talks over the last couple years, they didn't bring up U.S. troops during that period either, right? So they bring it up in certain instances. They seem to downplay it in other instances. It's really hard to understand what North Korea's motivation is. Of course, on one hand, it could be the fact that they just want some reciprocity. They just want something to be on the agenda that they can take back. On the other hand, is it maybe a ploy that once we get it on the agenda, then all of a sudden we can't backtrack and now they need to have a deliverable or outcome from that specific agenda item? You could see it both ways, right?
That's why the wording is important. If the wording was the disposition of U.S. forces in Korea, that's very vague and allows them to talk all three sides of the issue. If it's very specifically withdrawal, then that's something else, too specific, I would say. So that's why I'm interested. I don't recall exactly what the wording was.
Okay. Chip.
I appreciate Bob's point. It could very well have been a lack of sophistication on our part on how to play this issue. If North Korea wanted something on the agenda, you and Phil and the other folks that play in this diplomatic arena much more than anybody in the Pentagon does, there could have been a backdoor agreement that we're not going to put this on unless it says this and you give us this other thing. But we didn't do that, and I think it's probably this was all still pretty new to all of us at the time on negotiating with North Korea, and I think that we weren't as smart as we thought we were.
Yeah, so let me jump in here too, just for additional context. I think that's right. I mean, it seems like now the way we talk about this is that people have to remember that it was not until like 1992 and really 94 we had really significant interactions with the North Koreans. We didn't have a lot at that point. So, everyone can be forgiven for the lack of sophistication to some degree, especially throughout the whole bureaucracy. It takes a while for that to filter through. You can't say that now in the sense where you have a fair amount of interaction, although it's, I think, most recently it's been more one-sided where it's been since the Six Party, it's more about North Korea saying no all the time and instead of getting to yes. Okay. So that's another set of experiences that I think are important. But I also have to say that with North Korea, it's true. The idea was, this was about, in my mind, hypothesis testing, right? And as Bob says, if you structure it in the right way, you can actually, to answer your question, Frank, is this a ruse or isn't it? Are they serious or are they not? If you don't ask the question, and if you're not given the freedom to start testing and probing, you're not going to get anywhere. And so I think that was sort of the argument that we were making on state. And, quite frankly, when we were putting together the Perry process, trying to talk about whether we address a peace treaty or not and how we go about it, there were internal discussions about that as well, what would be cleared and what wouldn't be. And so, to me, the bigger picture, and I think one lesson learned, you'll get to this later, is don't be afraid to test hypotheses. That's what this is all about. And if you don't have that opportunity and you don't learn anything, you're not going to get anywhere. And I think that the whole relationship with North Korea is a perfect example where we're not learning the lessons that we need to learn from all of this.
It's interesting because this sort of interaction came up again in 2018 with the discussion about the end of war declaration and what that means. There were certainly people conflating an end of war declaration with a peace treaty or a peace regime. I think there were reports that the State Department was willing to contemplate that idea. DOD was more skeptical, again, because of the implications for U.S. forces and all that. But it's interesting that the same debate recurs again and again. Real quick question to Chip, and then I'm going to go back to another question. But sticking with confidence building measures, was there any other confidence building measures that DOD was okay with if the discussion of U.S. troops wasn't kosher? So what else could have we talked about in terms of tension reduction?
We could have talked about a lot more South Korean presence in North Korea. The Kaesong industrial complex was, I thought, a pretty neat thing. I mean, yeah, there was a lot to worry about with that, but when you think about it, we got a lot more people inside North Korea that had never been inside North Korea before, and that had to have a positive effect, not just on relations, but on collection and everything else. We could have demanded the more access for aid-giving organizations to North Korea. We were just coming out of a horrific famine in those days, and with an extraordinary number of fatalities, and there was reason to believe that we could head off more if that happened. One of the things that happens with getting the aid-giving organizations in there is we're working directly with the North Korean public, and even autocratic leaders have to worry at some point about popular support. And if we could have made more contact with the Korean population, that would do. Harder things to do would be getting some agreement of North Korea to start withdrawing artillery from the Kaesong Heights. And again, it's the nuclear issue that drowns everything out, but Seoul is already under an existential threat just from conventional artillery before you even add in chemical weapons that are quite likely. So there were a lot of things that we could do, but Phil may have better memory of this than I do, or Bob, but I don't remember that we went very far down the road on any other confidence building measures that we might introduce. One famous humanitarian guy, Andrew Natsios, many of you probably remember him. He was in and out of North Korea a lot, and the information he brought out of North Korea in his dealings with the North Korean population, it just left you slack-jawed because he was describing a charnel house. And it might be cynical, but we never exploited that with trying to talk about what North Korea is doing to their own people. And I think we could have, and we may have been able to gain some leverage out of that. I don't know. We didn't try it, so that's a theory, but unproven.
Thank you, Chip. I want to jump to the next question. I'll direct it to Phil and Chip, but of course, Bob, you can jump in if you want as well. So one of the confusing aspects of this period was that there were a lot of talks going on simultaneously, it seems. There was the missile talks, there were the four-party peace talks, there was the discussion about the the facility at Kumchangni. And then, of course, we got into the Perry process later. And it's hard to sometimes understand, unless you were there at the time, how these various talks bleeded together. Were they separate? Were one and the same? Did they work at cross purposes? So starting with Phil, how did these talks relate? And did they undermine each other, or were they complementary?
Well, I have to give great credit to, I would say Chuck Cartman in terms of keeping all this straight. Okay. I think we had the agreed framework, and then you had the agreed framework, which is essentially bilateral in terms of the negotiations. And then you had the submarine talks that were between the US and North Korea. But after that, everything that went forward, this is one of the great credits that I give to the four-party talks. The four-party talks were the cover or the platform in which everything else was able to emanate from, and was the basis, I think, in sort of a lot of the discussions that we had. We had these initial Kumchangni talks. I mean, part of it was the United States was afraid the great framework was going to start falling apart. So we started initiating these conversations, and the missile went over. But in the end, we were able to use the four-party as a way for us to have these conversations. Unlike the six-party talks, which was really created to in my mind, to prevent the United States. The United States didn't want to talk with North Korea. So the six-party talks were put in to create that mechanism. Here, it was a mechanism for us to continue conversations, and really, in the end, for North Korea and South Korea to continue as well. So in my mind, there are some exceptions here and there, but the Perry process, the missile negotiations, Kumchangni, the four-party talks were us always going back together again to have that kind of conversation. I do remember, if I recall, I think it was in Beijing, there were four-party talks, but we really didn't have four-party talks. It was all bilateral conversations with us, filling the South Koreans in on what was going on. So that's kind of the way I looked at it. And again, I give great credit to Chuck, sort of being the person to make sure all of this sort of fit together.
I'm glad Phil brought up Chuck Cartman and his role, and in retrospect, I think he should have been given far more authority on our side, and maybe we would have stayed a little bit more coordinated. Part of the genesis of the Perry process, as I recall, was that we were getting a lot of worried sounds out of Japan and South Korea that they had lost track of what we were doing. Phil mentioned the rocket that went over Honshu. This was an interesting time. We were in negotiations with the North Koreans at the UN headquarters. They were being remarkably cooperative and looked like they wanted a deal. And we all, including Chuck, got suspicious, so we broke for the weekend. It was scheduled to be 2 weeks of talks. So we broke for the weekend at the end of the first week, and that was the weekend when the rocket went over Honshu.
Yeah.
And Phil may remember this. We delayed going back to New York for 2 full days, Monday and Tuesday, trying to find authorities in the United States that would change our negotiating instructions. Silence from our superiors. So we went back up to New York with our original negotiating instructions. We got a deal in line with our original negotiating instructions, and everybody's cell phone blew up on the way to the airport with people yelling at us because we signed the deal. Well, we asked you to change the instructions, but you didn't. So Congress got worried. They had a hearing, and the National Security Advisor, his name will come back in a moment, was testifying, and he said, we're going to start a process. We're going to get somebody to run it. Well, who's going to run it? Well, we don't know. And all this back. And finally, he said, somebody like a Bill Perry. Bang, that was Friday afternoon. The gavel comes down. Everybody goes home. Bill Perry picks up his weekend newspaper, the San Jose Mercury News, and finds he's been named a special envoy to the Korean Party process. He comes to Washington next week, and he was angry because he'd been ambushed on this. Nobody told him. And he in that conference room right off of the State Department office there, he had a bunch of us in there. Phil, I think you were there.
Yeah.
And we all told him in one way or another, our allies don't trust us anymore. And he said, you're wrong. Flew off to Japan, to Seoul, came back. We're all in the same conference room again. And he's lecturing us saying our allies don't trust us anymore. Oh, I heard that somewhere. So this was not a high point of organization on how we were doing. North Korea was still a sideshow, and still our mono focus was on the North Korean nuclear program, not on the overall security situation of Northeast Asia and the overall threat that North Korea embodied, not just to South Korea and Japan and everybody, but to their own people. And Bill Perry tried hard. We went to North Korea bearing gifts. We had a big trunk full of medical supplies. The North Koreans, and Bob knows this tendency of North Koreans far better than I do, but the happy sounds, you're going to get to meet the dear leader, you're going to meet the dear leader. So for 2 days, they're pumping us up. And then the last day, they just stone-faced, no questions, nothing answered. And it had a psychological effect on those of us in the party that were there with Bill Perry, that, oh my God, we failed. No, you didn't fail. This is North Korea. This is part of the normal process, if you can call it a process. But it was high drama. And by the way, Perry's special assistant along there at the time was Ash Carter, who then went on to have his own North Korean dream when he came back to the government in a higher position. So no good deed goes unpunished with North Korea.
So we had the Perry process, and then by the time we got to 2000, we sort of swept up in summitry, right? Or at least there was the Inter-Korean Summit, and then the meeting with Madeleine Albright, and then the return trip with Vice Marshal Cho. Did that just kind of subsume the four-party peace talks? So I think the last one was in '99, but at that point, I think everyone was caught up in the summitry and the very senior level meetings. Bob, you're shaking your head, but you're muted.
It's a good thing I'm muted. I've been muttering. Now, look, the four-party talks never had a chance. It never was going to go anywhere. It never got traction. It never accomplished anything. I can tell you after the first meeting, and I was Chuck's advisor. And I said to Chuck, I'll never say this publicly, but these will never succeed. These are never going to go anywhere. And it was just clear to me that it couldn't go anywhere. Phil is right. We used it as an opportunity to have bilateral talks with the North Koreans on other issues. But that's not much in favor of four-party talks. As for coordinating everything, I would take a different view. One of the problems was the U.S., other than Chuck, the U.S. government really didn't have a central point for the policy. As far as I'm concerned, he thought the agreed framework talks and what was built out of that should be the center of our policy. Missile talks were not well conceived, were not well plugged in, almost accomplished nothing until the end. The Kumjong-ni talks were very important, but it was because it was a big drain on our intellectual and diplomatic energy. We had to get over that. So all through this, it was agreed framework. The agreed framework was so important because it was not just the words on paper. It was the environment that it created for all sorts of other talks. Between all different parties, all under this umbrella, this atmosphere that the agreed framework had created. I think that's important. Four-party didn't fit into that. Four-party was badly conceived. As Chip and Phil pointed out, it was dropped on the bureaucracy. No one knew really how to make it work. Why in the world were the Chinese there? Only because the South Koreans didn't want it to be three-way talks. So it was just an it was a zebra combined with a tiger combined with an ostrich. It just couldn't survive. And by 99, the Swiss hosted this thing. They paid for a lot of stuff, and they used to give us nice croissant during the coffee breaks. As we had more and more meetings, which weren't going anywhere, the croissant got smaller and smaller and smaller. So by 99, they were minuscule. And to me, that was a sure sign that this was not going to.
Yeah.
Only a good intelligence officer would pick up on that indicator.
Bob, thank you for that candor. I think we're running out of time, but I appreciate that pessimism, because I feel like, for those of us who want these types of talks, peace talks, it gets to that question of, okay, well, what can we learn from this period? And this is basically the last question to finish up, the takeaways and the lessons, right? Because you talked about the woeful lack of preparation. Phil mentioned the ambiguous nature of the initial proposal. But I'm not even sure if we prepared meticulously for the talks, even if the proposal was specific and clear, I'm still not sure that North Korea would have responded differently. They may still have taken a lot of time to respond. They may still have proposed what they wanted to have on the agenda. So, what are the takeaways? We talked about all these things that were wrong about it, but what can we take from that experience if we ever get to the point in the future where it's appropriate to have these sorts of discussions on normalization and peace? And anyone, so whoever wants to jump in first.
So let me jump in really quickly. One is that I have come to realize that is a fact of nature. It is a reality that things are going to get dropped on us no matter what. Things are going to be conceived for various reasons. And so my lesson learned is expect something like this. It's always going to happen. And the best thing you do is you make lemonade out of lemons. And so I kind of disagree with Bob, is that I think the four-party talks allowed us to deal with South Korea, at least initially, in a way that it made it easier for us to do that, and gave us the platform where they had some way to interact with the North Koreans to some degree, and politically that was good for them. I think that one of the lessons I learned from that period is that seemingly intractable positions, such as who signs and who doesn't, troops, all of that change. And I think that, I had an argument with someone who said that, countries' interests do not change over time. Yeah, that may be the case, but I do believe that governments' perceptions of what their interests do. And I think the art of diplomacy is creating possibilities and ways for people to look at things in a different manner. And I think that is, from that time to now, is a really great demonstration of that. And then finally, I think what this period shows to me is that, timing this, I kind of relate the Perry process as part of that whole area, is all one big package, is that timing is everything. And so when the timing is right, you got to go for it, and you got to go for it really big. And that is an argument for being bold when you can.
That's a good point. I think we've seen how things change over time. You mentioned, we talked about North Korea's, willingness to engage with South Korea or sit at the same table with South Korea and China. And I mentioned this earlier, but Kim Jong-un, one of his statements, I think it might have been in 2018, he talked about being willing to, at some point, open up the process from a bilateral USIP to a multilateral process with China and South Korea. So you're right. And with more experience, they become more acclimated to these different negotiating formats. Bob, Chip, any other takeaways, lessons learned from the four-party talks? Chip.
I put a couple of things on the table. One of the questions that came in on chat was whether we crossed the Rubicon of format since the Trump-Kim summits. No, I don't think so. We can get back to regular order now so that the staff can do their jobs. But what I think one of the things out of not only the four-party talks, but the Perry process and everything else, is that it's okay to be talking to North Korea about denuclearization. As a matter of fact, we should do that, but we need to broaden the aperture here. What's really important, what we're really talking about at the root here, is the safety and the security of our allies and friends. So we need to keep our eye on that and then put it into context so that then we can find some common interest, Russia, China, South Korea, Japan, United States, to go forward. I fear that we hurt our credibility in the United States when we hang everything on one issue of denuclearization. Number one, Kim's not going to voluntarily give up his nuclear weapons, because without his nuclear weapons, he has nothing. And number two, a candid self-examination. What could we offer North Korea as a security guarantee that North Korea would believe? They know we change governments every 4 years, every 8 anyway, and that the guarantees of one administration oftentimes don't go into the next administration. They know that there's UN study after UN study on North Korea's brutalization of its own population. Sooner or later, the United States wakes up to human rights. We're in one of those phases right now where that puts Kim in a very bad light. So all of which is to say, yes, talking is good, chat, jaw is better than war, but we've got to make sure that we're addressing the right objectives and putting things in the right context and not pinning everything on something that I've come to believe is not going to happen.
We have a little less than 15 minutes left, so I want to get to the audience questions. But Bob, any thoughts on takeaways?
Let's get to the audience. I think that'll be useful. Yeah.
Okay, so Chip referred to the first question, which gets to the format of the talks. We had the precedent set of the leader to leader level summit. So the question is, have we now crossed the Rubicon in terms of format since the Trump-Kim summits? Can we go back to a multilateral format that's initiated by working level talks? And should we go back to the format? So, two different questions here. One is, bilateral, 4-party, 6-party, multilateral, and then also going from working level to more senior levels. Any thoughts on those format questions? And I will address it to Bob first.
I don't think multilateral works with North Korea. Certainly not going in, not until quite a bit has been established. We saw with Quito that you can have multilateral talks with the North Koreans, very useful ones, but it's a very particular type of format, talking about a very specific type of issue. Broader talks in a multilateral setting, seems to me, is just asking for trouble. So my view is those don't work very well. That has nothing to do with the summit. Yes, it's a good thing Trump opened that door. It means we can get back to it more easily when it's the proper time. It isn't the proper time now, obviously, and we got a lot of work to do before it will be. Don't forget, Kim Jong-un is not going to risk his reputation again going into a summit with an American president and coming out with nothing. So I think he's going to want to see a likelihood of progress as much as we are.
So I'll jump in. I think it's a version of all of the above. I think that multilateral at the beginning is not helpful. It is incredibly unwieldy. 4-party talks, just, 3 of us can remember this. I mean, oh my God, right? Translations, everyone saying something, it was interminable forever. And that's why Chip was saying, get a book, right? There's something to be said for that. But that's not to say that at a later stage, multilateral will not be critical, because I do think that if we're serious about creating a security environment, if we believe that North Korea ultimately wants security, it's just not going to rely on the United States word or South Korea's word. There's got to be other people involved, and that will have to happen at some stage. I do also credit Trump with this notion of symmetry, but it has to be combined smartly with working level. And I think that's been the problem all along, where at least the previous with Trump and Bush and Obama, it was one or the other. And what I mean by that is Trump was all symmetry and nothing working level. And I think the Bush years in particular was all working level and no taste of symmetry or high level, which also made it very difficult. So it's got to be a combination of both.
Chip, any thoughts?
Trump was not the first and not the only American politician to think that somehow a personal relationship can be established across cultures, across countries with bone deep differences. We had some of that during the Clinton administration, and that brings me back to what I said at probably too much length before about we need to keep our eye on the prize here. It's the safety and security of our allies and friends. The nuclear weapons to North Korea are a part of it, but they're only a part of it. And we can multilateralize the process, but it's got to be part of a bigger process. We got other things to talk about with Russia than North Korea, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about North Korea with them. Same thing with China, and put this thing into context. Our other remedies, like sanctions, have proven to be a failure. One after another, we impose a set of sanctions when we get tired of negotiations, agreements, and cheating on agreements. And North Korea always finds a way to work around the sanctions fairly easily. There's a bigger issue here that we need to tackle instead of continuing to embarrass ourselves by focusing on Mission Impossible by itself.
Thanks, Chip. It seems to me that, the path of least resistance for North Korea has been the bilateral level talks. And so I like the idea of combining the formats where you start with bilateral to get North Korea on board. And then as things develop, you bring in different players as necessary according to their interests. So from the bilateral to a four-party, eventually six-party, and internationalizing it as the needs rise. So the next question I want to raise relates to an end of war declaration. So last week there was the House Armed Services Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee had a hearing, and Representative Andy Kim raised the question about the possibility of declaring an end to the Korean War. He asked it of General Abrams, who basically said it's end of war declaration is not a problem from a military standpoint, but it has to be part of a bigger plan. Secretary Blinken had more of a political response, basically saying, well, we need to review the issue further, right? But what are your thoughts on an end of war declaration as a part of the process to kick off further negotiations with North Korea? And anyone can jump in, but I will direct it to Bob first if no one else jumps in.
Okay, it seems to me that people should go back to the October 2000 joint communique, which is a sort of a pathway to that. We said both countries will avoid, it's either hostile policies or
right to exist.
Intent, toward the other. The next step from that can be the era of the Korean War is over. Now, that sounds soft and sort of goofy, but it's not, because it allows both sides to take a number of steps under an umbrella of a transformed situation and still have in front of them the problem of moving from the armistice to the peace regime, but it gives it impetus. It allows both sides to agree that they're going to be serious about this. They're going to go slowly, and a lot of the other things that have been attached to the Korean War, such as a lot of the U.S. sanctions, which date back to then, can be dealt with without any sense of contradicting their central policies. So I think we can go at this step by step. I think it's a good idea.
So my view is, again, just the devil's in the details in all this. Is it just simply just saying it? There's a part of me that wants to again, hypothesis tests with the North Koreans. One of their big talking points has always been the reason why they have nuclear weapons, the reason why they have so many troops is because they're in a state of war with the United States. We're the enemy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it seems to me that, if that's the impediment, is there a way in which we can get rid of that impediment to see if they're really genuine about what they want to do or not? I mean, intellectually, there's one can say, well, you can see, if you look at their perspective, they're saying, why should we give this up when we're still enemies, right? So let's test that. So in principle, I don't think it's a bad idea, but with a simple declaration, I can see where they're going to say, well, we still have the armistice. You get into all these other issues here, right? We still have the armistice. It's a ceasefire. We're still in a state of war. So you've got to formally end this state of war, I think. And the mechanism for that has to be thought through. But that's what I would be looking at.
Thank you. And then let's go to our last question, which is on U.S. troop withdrawals. We talked about this earlier, and Chip had a lot of great points about it. So 2021, we're in a different situation. South Korea's defense and deterrence capabilities have been enhanced incredibly, certainly over the last decade. They have a very capable and competent military, and they've been acquiring additional capabilities, including things like F-35s, Apache helicopters. They're developing their own indigenous Korean fighter. They're talking about acquiring Iron Dome, not to mention their extended ballistic missile, the range of their ballistic missiles, as well as enhanced payloads. So they're taking a lot of steps, and as well as their ballistic missile defense, right? Not only the U.S. deployment of THAAD, but their own GEM-T systems. Now that South Korea's military has grown stronger, and the U.S. military should be looking at our force posture, not in terms of just numbers, but also capabilities and what the mission is, not only on the Korean Peninsula, but in the region. Can we readdress the issue of the U.S. force posture on the Korean Peninsula? Certainly, we're not going to raise it if North Korea doesn't. It's not that much of a concern for us. But how do we think about the force posture issue today differently from 20 years ago? And I'll go to Chip first for this one.
There has been over time a gradual decrease in the mathematical number of troops on the peninsula. The latest figure that I knew was 28,500, and it became almost a religious totem that we had to be there every day. It even raised political issues if we had to or wanted to take a squadron to maintain their air combat proficiency. So there is that force. There is one U.S. element on the DMZ, and that's the 2nd Infantry Division, the famous Indian Head Division. It's got 10,000 U.S. troops. It's got 1,100 Korean troops as part of that. But the vast majority of the 3rd ROK Army and the 1st ROK Army that is guarding the northern approaches to South Korea are all obviously Korean. So it's not like there are U.S. forces poised on the DMZ to invade North Korea, which invading somebody through the most fortified border in the history of the planet is not really a good idea. The vast majority of the 28,500 that we have there on the peninsula are other than combat troops, engineers, communications, logistics, maintenance, Air Force at Osan Air Base, and this. So can we make adjustments to it? Yes, we make adjustments to it over time. The next big adjustment is going to be the transfer of OPCON control that we talked about earlier, but that's both sides agree, both the Koreans and the U.S. agree that conditions have to be met, and then we'll do that. The North Korean myth that the United States is poised in the starters blocks to invade North Korea is absolutely not true. We're there to defend the Republic of Korea. And we don't emphasize that enough. As far as the declaration of end of war and things that we talked about, you can develop over time a long list of conditions that should be met under that end of war principle, one of which is to get rid of the cocked pistol posture of the North Koreans on the border with South Korea. I think South Korea would agree with that too. Not to mention the periodic provocations that occur, and they've been deadly in the past. And what does an end of war declaration mean in terms of like the sinking of the Cheonan or the attack in the joint security area that killed 2 U.S. troops, or the ones that were mentioned earlier about the EC-121 that was shot down, the seizure of the Pueblo and things like that? How do we treat that if we've signed an end of war declaration? And what does it say about an end of war declaration?
So,
all good questions.
Yeah.
Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, Frank, again, U.S. troops, the disposition, all of that. I mean, you can't that's one narrow slice of the geography, right? I mean, there's a larger issue here between the United States and China. And I think the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia has to figure highly prominently into that. And part of that has to, that kind of conversation, engenders a lot, much larger issues here that have to be considered carefully. And I think that ultimately within that context, one has to figure out what the rationale would be for for U.S. troops. And I think there is one, but that's something that has to be articulated very clearly, not only for the Chinese and the South Koreans and others in East Asia, but for the American public themselves. And that's something that's, I think has to be well thought through.
Thanks, Phil. I want to give Bob the last word before we end this session. So, Bob.
It's useful to go back, as you said, 25 years and see if we can pull any meaning out of what went on. I think most of the lessons are negative ones, but that's fine. Nothing wrong with negative lessons if it helps you avoid getting into the same swamp. The situation is so different now. Kim Jong-un is a completely different cat than his father was. We have very little experience, unfortunately, in dealing with him or understanding him. And so that's going to have to be job one, the reconnaissance, to figure out what he wants, what he thinks, how he works. We made a stab at that in 2018, 2019, but we fell backwards, and we have to recover, I think, a lot of that ground before we can really launch into substantive engagement.
Thanks, Bob. And so I'll end it here. I want to thank all of our speakers for contributing their thoughts, and I apologize for making them reach back 25. I can barely remember what I ate for breakfast yesterday. And so going back 25 years and dusting off the folders, I really appreciate it. I also want to thank our AV team and my colleague, Lucy Stevenson-Yang, for helping put the event together. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you again to the speakers as well. Take care.
Thank you, Frank.
Thanks, Frank.